Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games and Battle Report number 1 between the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers and the Scions of the Flame. The Shroud Queen will be leading the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers into battle, while the Blazing Lord is assembling his warband for the Scions of the Flame. In the dagger, the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers have the Dark Flame Warlock with Doomfire Ring, Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords, and a Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear. In the shield is the Shroud Queen, the Slaughter Shade with Shadow Whip, and another Shroud Blade. And in the hammer is the Dark Flame Warlock with Repeater Crossbows, a Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords, and a Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear. In the Scions dagger, we have the Brazen Champion and the Immolator. In the shield, we have the Blazing Lord with Initiate and Inferno Priest. And in the hammer, we have 2 Fireborns and an Initiate. Both warbands roll off for the priority, and the priority goes to the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers. Now it's time for the battle plan, and we draw terrain number 4 from the Catacomb set. The Fog of War for our deployment card. Our victory card is called Seize Territory. And finally, the twist is Bitter Rivals. The terrain set up on the battlefield, our deployment points are marked with the green arrows, and our Shroud Queen chooses to take the red deployment zones. And the daggers are the first to be set up, with the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers setting up first within 3 inches of the deployment point. Then the Scions set up within 3 inches of the dagger deployment zone, and then following that, warbands take turns to set up on the edge of the board, waiting to come on for the round 2. Now our battlefield's set up and our warbands are ready to start the battle. It's time to take a look at the victory card called Seize Territory. The players roll off and the winner chooses who is the attacker and who is the defender. The defender places 3 objectives on the battlefield, each more than 6 inches from any other objectives and the battlefield edge. At the end of the 4th round, the player who controls the most objective wins the battle. If the players control an equal number of objectives, the attacker wins the battle. It's roll-off time, and the warbands roll off, and then the Scions choose to be the defenders, and they get to place the objective markers on the battlefield. And now we know where the deployment zones are. This is a strategic part of the battle, and the Scions are definitely going to capitalise with these placements and defend them against the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers. With the deployment points spread out like this, the Scions of the Flame are pretty confident that they can hold at least 2 of these while keeping the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers at bay. Now with the objective markers in place, let's take a look at the twist. The leaders of these warbands share a mutual hatred, having exchanged insults and grievous wounds over the course of several battles. Add 1 to the attacks and strength characteristics of attack actions made by fighters with the leader rune mark that target an enemy fighter who also has the leader rune mark. This battle that have a range characteristic of 3 or less. With our battlefield set up and our 2 warbands ready for action, our rivals are ready to take each other on, so let's move on to round 1 and get the action started. And in round 1, the hero phase, the Scions go first, and they roll their 6 dice, and they end up with 2 doubles and 2 singles. Now it's the turn of the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers, and they roll a triple, a double, and a single. So that gives the initiative to the Scions. The Scions decide to make their double a triple, and the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers decide to take their triple and go straight in for a quad. And the priority stays with the Scions of the Flame, and the Immolator decides to make 1 move towards that objective, and then chooses to use the second action as a wait, and that effectively ends his turn. Then it's the time for the Dark Flame Warlock, who double moves to get as close as they can to the Scions, and then they go straight in with their quad ability. And with the Rampage quad ability, the Warlock's going to move, and then he's going to make another attack action. And so he's looking here at the distant, and he's within his 7 range, and so he's going to use his range weapon against the Brazen Champion. The Doomfire ring shoots across the open battlefield, and immediately we've got our first critical hit of the match, and that's going to deal 4 damage to our Brazen Champion. That's the end of the first activation for our Dark Flame Warlock, and he's feeling pretty pleased with himself, getting some damage there that early on. And now it's the turn of the Brazen Champion, who decides to retreat behind some cover, and then is going to use his second action to wait, effectively ending his activation. Surprising to see the Scions taking a defensive stance in round 1, but let's see what happens as we progress here. So now it's the turn of our Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords, and they're moving in for 1 move action, and then they're going to use a double ability, which is the Cursed Darts, and she's going to take a sneaky attack at our Brazen Champion. So that cover didn't work out for him all that well here, and let's see what the result of that is. The 2 Cursed Darts fly across the battlefield, and bad news for the Brazen Champion, 1 hits its mark, and that's going to give him 2 more wounds, taking up to a total of 6 wounds already. That ends the activation for our Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords, and now our Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear is looking to get some high ground and is eyeing up that bell tower, so she does a double move action and moves in place, then ending her activation, and she's going to wait there until round 2, and let's see what she does then. And that's all the fighters from both warbands. Dagger now activated, and so that brings us to the end of round 1, and we've seen a little bit of hesitant action from the Scions of the Flame, but the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers are really starting to move in, and we can see here that the Brazen Champion is holding one of the objectives and the Immolator holding the other, and they're trying to use that cover there, but our Dark Flame Warlock has been able to come around there using that quad ability and getting in some sneaky hits, while our Shroud Blades have moved into some good positions, eyeing up that next objective. The Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords is in a good position there to come in and have a go at the Brazen Champion and cause him a bit of trouble, distracting him from the objective. And in round 2 we're going to see our shields come into action, and our Scion shield at the top there are going to look to come in on the 3rd objective, but also cut off the hammer of the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers. So it'll be interesting to see what they can do there and how the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers react. The Scions have got some options with their hammer there coming in from the bottom left corner, and they can either cut off the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers shield, or they can move up to some high ground to eye up that objective and cut off the path of our Dark Flame Warlock and the other KHAINITE Shadowstalkers as they come on the battlefield. In the top right, our Shadowstalkers are going to move in, and they've got an option to come around the building, but this is going to take up quite a lot of move actions there and wasting maybe a couple of turns. They could go around the back of the building or even come over the top. And then we've also got our Shadowstalkers at the bottom of the battlefield, and they're going to be looking to cut off any preemptive attacks from the Scions from the bottom left, or they're going to look to move up towards that objective and strengthen up with their Dark Flame Warlock and cause a bit of trouble here. So let's move on to round 2 and we'll see what action takes place. It's round 2 hero phase, and the Scions go first, and they roll a triple, a single and a double, and the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers, they roll quad 6, 2 singles, so great roll for those. And with the initiative, they make one of those singles a double, and the Scions make their triple 5 a quad 5. And now with 1 single each, they roll off to see who has priority, and they both roll a 5, so it's time to roll off one more time, and this time the Scions get a 5, the Shadowstalkers a 2, so the Scions get the priority going into round 2. With our priority established, we check the deployment card, and now all of the shield and hammer deploy, and they're going to be deployed within 3 inches of the deployment point. So the Scions set up theirs, and the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers react to that too. And so we're 3 inches from the edge of the battlefield there, and with all the deployment's now taken place. It's time to move on and get started with round 2. Our Scions go first, and they just check the terrain there to make sure it's under an inch or under, and they're going to make a move straight towards the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers hammer, and the Inferno Priest is taking the lead there, and she's going to go straight in and attack them. She used up her 2 actions with move actions. She's making advantage of that 5 quad, which is Engulf in Flames. She picks a target, 1 visible enemy fighter, and rolls 6 dice. For every 2+, she's going to inflict damage points equal to half the value of her ability rounding up. So that's a huge amount of damage there, and she's going to inflict 10, 15, 18 damage, taking out our first casualty of the battle. And the Dark Flame Warlock with repeater crossbows didn't get any action in this battle and is removed, and that ends the Infernal Priest's activation. Now it's turn for our Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear, and she's just checking the distance there and making sure not to land on any obstacles, and with a movement of 5 she lands, checks she's in range for an attack but has to make a quick roll for falling damage, and with a 3 she's fine, and then so uses her next action to make an attack against the Brazen Champion. And with a 4 and 6, that's a hit and a critical hit, and with just that 1 miss there, so not bad at all, and that's going to give the Brazen Champion some more wounds, adding 5 to his total wounds there. And she's not finished yet. She's going to use up one of the doubles to use the Cursed Darts ability, and those 2 Cursed Darts fly right into the face of the Brazen Champion. 1 misses, flies right by, but the other one hits, causing him some extra damage, and this guy's taking it from all angles during this battlefield, and now that's going to give him an extra 2 wounds, taking him up to a total of 13. A great round for our Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear, and that ends her activation. But now it's time for the Brazen Champion to get some revenge. He checks his range, he's not happy with this at all, and starts to go on the attack against our Shroud Blade. And rolling his 3 dice, a huge double critical hits and a 3. She was feeling cocky earlier, but I bet she wishes she stayed back now after taking a crazy 15 damage, and that removes her from the battlefield, and it's good night for the Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear. And there she goes, taken off, and that ends the activation for our Brazen Champion, who's now feeling pretty pleased with himself. In all the excitement, he forgot that was just 1 action, so with his next action, he chose to move, and he's going to go back towards his Blazing Lord and the Immolator and really strengthen their hold on the 2 furthest objectives, and now that really does end his activation. Okay, now it's a Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords, who's again looking for that high point, and so moving up with double moves this turn, and then that's going to end the activation for our Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords, who's eyeing up that objective, but they've got a lot to get through to get there. With a nice hold on 2 objectives, the Brazen Lord issues the command for the Initiate with Morningstar to back up the Inferno Priest, and he chooses to double move and give her support in the far corner, completely cutting off any advances that the Shadowstalkers are going to want to make around that building. But the Shadowstalkers choose to engage rather than evade this attack, and our second Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords moves forward and in range of the Inferno Priest. And she's going to roll to make an attack on the Inferno Priest, and with 4 dice, that's a terrible roll, and not even 1 damage or wound inflicted on the Inferno Priest, so he holds off the attack, and that ends the activation for our Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords. The Scions are starting to move forward, and their hammer is just measuring up to see how they can get some high ground there, and so our Initiate is taking a double move to get some high ground, looking down on the objective and just waiting to see exactly what the Shadowstalker's going to do on their turn. And now it's their turn for the Dark Flame Warlock, and he had a great first round, and now he's moving straight in for the attack, eyeing up that Immolator on the far objective. And now he's got a choice here of the Immolator, but he looks to his right and sees the Brazen Champion has got a little bit of cover through the obstacle there, but he can certainly get a shot off if he's lucky. So with his Doomfire Ring, he gets a 5 and a critical hit, more than enough to give some extra damage to that Brazen Champion, who's had a terrible round 1 and 2 so far. And now that's going to be another 6 wounds, and that's going to remove him from the battlefield, and that's the end of the battle for this big guy who didn't really get in on the action early enough on, and should maybe not have hesitated and been so defensive. So he's removed from battle, and that ends the activation for our Dark Flame Warlock with Doomfire Ring, who's had a great round 1 and 2. And it looks like the Scion's Hammer are reluctant to engage the shield, and they're using this building to get up with a double move action, and that's going to end the activation for our first Fireborn. And now back into the far corner, our Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear is going to have a go at the Inferno Priest, and rather than taking evasive action around the building, he's getting straight in the action and hoping to cut them off so they can move forward and get to the objectives quicker. So far, the Inferno Priest has proved to be pretty tough, so with 3 attacks, not much is getting through the defences here in this tight corner, and we're just going to see 1 wound inflicted on the Inferno Priest, and with 14 remaining, she's pretty tough and in a good position. And that ends the activation for our Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear. And deciding to stick with the pack, our second Fireborn, he decides to get up there onto the high ground as well, and use that cover that it's going to give so that they can move towards the objective. And now it's turn for the Shadowstalkers to start moving in, and our Shroud Queen is just checking some distances there, checking her movement. A double move will get her right on the objective and also put her within range of 4 of the enemy fighters. And now she's just checking the distance between the fighters there, and the Scions knew what was coming with this quad 6s hanging around. She checks her visibility, and she can certainly see the 3 on top of the building and the Inferno Immolator who's trying to get away, and with her quad she's going for Ensnare in Darkness, and she's going to deal some serious damage here. But first she has to give herself 3 damage to draw Shadow Blood, and that's going to give her an extended range of 6, and now she can inflict the value of the ability to each fighter within 6 inches who's visible. So 4 fighters for the Scions, each take 6 damage, and that ends an amazing activation for the Shroud Queen, and she puts herself on the objective to take charge. Now our Blazing Lord has seen the commotion and moves towards her, and is going to look to defend that objective, and not close enough to make any attacks, he decides to end his activation there. And now it's the turn of our Shadowstalkers, and again checking some distance there, she's going to support the Shroud Queen, so our Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords makes a double move, and that's going to put her between the Shroud Queen and the oncoming Scion's Hammer, so she's going to be a bit defensive there and protect her queen, and that ends her activation. And now the Immolator, he's tired of sitting back defending the objective and decides to go on the offensive, and with a double move action he's going to come right in base contact and cut off any of those ranged attacks from our Dark Flame Warlock and the Doomfire Ring, and that ends his activation. And now it's the turn of our Slaughter Shade with Shadow Whip, and she's going to move and then make another move action, and keeping herself away from the Immolator but close enough to make an attack on the next turn, and she's going to back up her Dark Flame Warlock and also moving towards those objective and getting her closer to make an attack there, and maybe even sneak behind that Immolator. And that takes us to the end of round 2, and you can see there's been lots of movement here. We've had a few casualties, but the objectives, it still looks like they're in the hands of the Scions, and that corner's been well cut off, and here we got the Scions moving in, about to pounce on the Queen. And the Scions have done a great job up here in the top right of cutting off the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers, and that Inferno Priest has been pretty solid, that the Initiate is probably not even needed there anymore, but a good backup, and perhaps in round 3 he can start moving towards the objectives. But the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers, there's no chance of retreating now. They'd never make it to any other parts of the battle in time, and so they're going to have to fight it out in the corner. And now down in the bottom left, we've got the Scion's Hammer, and they did a good job of waiting for the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers to come in, and all 3 can pounce on the next turn, so initiative is going to be important for the Scions. And up here we've got our Blazing Lord holding that objective, using the terrain, and he's also got a nice line there to attack and protect the second objective, so he's looking pretty strong. The Immolator's moved in on the Darkflame Warlock and is also potentially in range for a move against the Slaughter Shade, so let's see how he holds both of those up. Losing the Darkflame Warlock with repeater crossbows was not cool for the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers in the top right, and now having to engage with even the flight option cut off because of the disengage actions. It's not great for them, but here we've got a nice position with our Shroud Blade with Curse Swords who can jump onto an objective and distract our Blazing Lord, so that's a really good move to get that height in the centre, and they've pretty much gone unnoticed to the Scions. Our Darkflame Warlock is pretty much tied up with the Immolator and is going to face off in round 3. And we've got our Slaughter Shade waiting to see what happens there with that little battle. Maybe she can get the initiative and move in, or sneak past the Immolator towards the objective. With that huge quad 6, the Shroud Queen really set round 3 up to be pretty interesting, and she's going to have her eye on that objective, but she's got to get across the Blazing Lord and also avoid the 3 here coming in from the bottom left. So she's got a lot to do, but backed up with the Shroud Blade, she's going to take some of the heat off her and perhaps allow her to move through there and cover that line as the Shroud Queen advances on the objective. And so with that recap of round 2, let's move on to round 3. Round 3 begins with a hero phase, and the Scions roll, and they end up with a double, another double, and 2 singles. And the Shadowstalkers roll, and they end up with a double, another double, and another double. And so the initiative go into the Scions. They choose to make a double into a triple. And the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers look at their options, and they're pretty happy with these 3 doubles. So they're going to keep their wild dice until round 4. And so moving in with the initiative go into the Scions. Let's see what their first action is going to be. And it looks like this Immolator's had enough and is going to take out the Warlock. And so rolling his 4 dice, he rolls a pretty average roll of a 4, 5, 2 and a 3. Not enough to take enough damage on our Warlock here, so he decides to go again. And again, much better now. He gets a couple of high ones there, 4, and that's enough to do some damage. So let's see how this affects our Warlock. And with 11 points, 12 points, that takes him out of the game, out of the battle, and he's done for the day. And now that's the Darkflame Warlock removed from the battlefield, but the Immolator's not done yet, and he's just checking some distances between the Slaughter Shade and the Shroud Queen, and sure enough, they're within distance for him to use his triple ability called Inferno. Not going to do a lot of damage here, and even though he rolls a 6, the value of his triple is only a 1, but still he does a little bit of damage to both the Slaughter Shade and the Shroud Queen, and each of those are going to take some wounds here, so it's 1 to the Slaughter Shade and 1 to the Shroud Queen. And that then ends his activation, and he's taken out a fighter, a little bit of damage on 2 others, so he's pretty pleased to be back in the fight now. But the Slaughter Shade didn't like that too much, and so he's going to take advantage of her whip and the range it gives her, and is going to go in straight onto the Immolator with an attack, and she rolls 4 dice, 2 critical hits, and this is going to deal some serious damage to our Immolator, but that's not enough for her, and she goes again, and with those 2 5s, this has got to mean the end for this big guy. Sure enough, with 10, 14 damage, that's enough wounds to put his fire out, and now this Immolator is extinguished and out of the battlefield. And as he's removed, that ends the activation for our Slaughter Shade, and she's pretty happy to get rid of this big guy off the battlefield and protect her queen there. Now it's the turn of the Scions, and the Initiate with the axe is going to move straight in, takes a roll to see if she takes falling damage. She did, so there's 1 damage for that jump, but it puts her in a nice position right up against the Shroud Queen, and she's going to make an attack there, and she managed to avoid the protection of that Shroud Blade and moves in, swinging her axe, and she's going to make 3 attacks, and this is huge with 2 crits and a hit. This is going to be some serious damage going on the Shroud Queen, and from an initiate, that's a heroic move for her, putting 10 damage wounds onto our Shroud Queen, taking her up to 11. And that ends the activation, and what a round for this young initiate here. And now it's the turn of the Shadowstalkers to react and take revenge for that sneaky move off the top of the wall there. And I think the initiate should be worried as the Shroud Queen turns and makes her attack 4 dice. We're looking at a crit and a hit. This is some big rolls coming from our Shroud Queen now. And with already those 6 damage, this extra wounds, another 7 wounds there, is going to be enough to take our initiate out of the battlefield, and it's game over for her. And as our initiate is removed from the battlefield, the Shroud Queen looks at her options, and for a second action decides to move and go straight towards that unmanned objective there. So with no one protecting it, she's going to put herself in a nice position, keeping some range between the Blazing Lord who's lurking in the background, and she's going to leave her Shroud Blade to take on the remaining Scions of the Flame who are coming in from the hammer deployment. And that ends the turn for the Shroud Queen. And now our Fireborn jumps in, takes the objective, and rolls for damage for falling, and survives. And now he's in a nice strong position to attack that Shroud Blade who stayed behind to allow her Shroud Queen to get to the objective. With his double weapons, this Fireborn's going to dish out some damage. Oh, it's a critical hit against the Shroud Blade and a hit, and she's going to take some damage there. And with only 8 wounds available, she takes 6, which really puts her in a pretty vulnerable position. And he's just checking the distance there. What's he up to next? Looks like he's going to use a double, which is throw the firebomb. And this was unexpected, but he's going to throw a firebomb at the Shroud Queen. And whoa, another 6. This guy's rolling, is on fire. And that some damage now being chucked at the Shroud Queen. And she's going to take 2 damage, which is slowly weakening her now. So he had a pretty good round there, a pretty good jump. Got some points on the Shroud Blade and the Shroud Queen. And that ends his activation. And now it's turn for the Shroud Blade with the Curse Swords to retaliate and give that Fireborn a taste of his own medicine. And with a flash of blades, she makes 4 attacks. Not a great roll, but that's going to be a little bit of damage there. But she decides to go again, and with another 4 attacks, this time there's a critical hit in there and a hit. And this is going to put enough damage to take this Fireborn out of the battle. And now he takes a total of 12 wounds altogether. And that's the battle ended for him. And he'll be removed now. And a good attack there from the Shroud Blade. And that puts her in a good position to keep hold of that objective. And also wait for that next Fireborn to come in. And so that's the end of her activation. And that Fireborn, he was watching and done exactly the same move as the previous Fireborn, jumping onto the objective. He's going to roll for damage, and he does get a little bit of falling damage there. So he's just going to take 1 wound, and then he's going to make an attack against the Shroud Blade. Give us some revenge against his fallen friend there. He takes a strike at her, and with just that hit, gives enough damage to give her a total of 8 wounds, and that's the Shroud Blade removed from the battlefield. But she did a great job of holding off that hammer, took 1 down, and prevented them from advancing onto a Shroud Queen too early. And that's the end of the activation for the Fireborn. And now it's the turn of the Shadowstalkers, and another Shroud Blade with Curse Sword jumps down from the bell there, rolls for damage, doesn't take any falling damage, and she can keep moving and chooses to advance again. And she's looking to make the most of those 5-inch movements to get between that Fireborn and the Shroud Queen. And a little check for distance shows that, yeah, we can use those cursed darts, and that's a double ability. And these cursed darts are getting lots of action today. And with the 6, that puts 2 wounds on the Fireborn, and that's also going to stop him from moving. That's going to halve his movement for into the next round, so he can only move 2. So he's already been though, so not too much of an effect, and that ends the activation for the Shroud Blade. And with our rival twist card in play, it's too tempting for our Blazing Lord to just stand back and man that objective while the Shroud Queen tries to take control. And he moves in within range to make an attack on her, uses one of his actions for a move, and now he's going to use his second action as an attack action, and he rolls against her and he gets that extra benefit that we saw, but a terrible roll, and that sees hardly anything happening here, just going to be a small amount of damage, and that's just going to put another 2 wounds onto our Shroud Queen, and she got off quite lightly there, and that's going to end the activation for our Blazing Lord. I have a battle report without the big green arrow, so here we go. Here's our Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear, and she's going to make an attack against that Inferno Priest, and it's getting personal over here now, and a nice roll with a 5 and a crit, and that's not enough to take the Inferno Priest out though, so she goes again, and 2 5s. This is great, and we're going to see some damage now going on, and that takes our Inferno Priest up to 8 wounds, but still hanging in tough with a total of 15, and that ends the activation for our Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear. But still not finished, so he decides to use the Cursed Darts ability, so we went in with the activation a bit early, and the darts fly at the Inferno Priest, but she just brushes them away with ease and doesn't take any further damage from that attack. And now, with that activation over, she's going to go on the counter, and she's going to attack the player that hasn't activated yet, which is the Shroud Blade, and she makes a nice roll there with a 4 and 5, and decides to go again with another 4 and 5, and this is going to be some serious damage at our final Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords, and let's see what she gets. This is going to be enough damage to take her out. It certainly is. With 10 wounds, that Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords is out, and that's the battle over for her. So there she goes, being removed from the battlefield. Didn't do anything really there, just got held up all game and has to sit the rest of it out. It was a great move from the Inferno Priest, taking out a player that hadn't yet activated. So now that means the final fighter to activate is the Initiate, and he's going to move straight onto that objective, and with there he's in range. He's going to end his activation with 2 move actions, and now he's claimed that objective marker, and he's going to wait there and defend it with everything he's got. So it's looking like a good position for the Scions here. They're holding some objectives. They've completely tied up that corner. The Inferno Priest has done such a great job. We've seen some casualties on both sides, with the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers and the Scions losing some fighters, and there's quite a lot of damage on these Scions thanks to the Shroud Queen earlier on. And the Inferno Priest has done a great job in that top right corner, really locking out that side of the battlefield and taking ownership of that little pass. Our initiative has now got the ability to guard that objective and keep out of range of most of the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers coming towards him. And he's got a nice line of defence there and a good arc with his ranged weapon to protect any oncoming attacks or opportunities for the objective. And then our Fireborn down there has taken that objective and he's holding it against the Shadowstalkers. He's got a nice line, and it's going to take a little bit of effort for the Slaughter Shade to get in close to. And then finally we've got the Blazing Lord fighting against his rival, the Shroud Queen, while trying to keep hold of an objective. And then if he can take her out, he can move on to the final Shroud Blade. And then looking at the end of round 3, the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers definitely missed a trick using their fly ability on a double to get over that early on, but instead chose to engage the Inferno Priest, and that could have been a huge mistake, and maybe it'll cost them the battle. We'll just have to wait and see. And then looking at the other fighters that we've got here, we've got the Slaughter Shade, who's got an option to move in through the gap, and she can make an attack at either the Blazing Lord or a Fireborn there. And if she goes for the Fireborn, that's an objective she could control, or she could at least draw it. And with the support of that Shroud Blade there, she's also got some options. So they could both team up, take out another fighter, or they could go for the big guy, the Blazing Lord, who's tangled up with the Shroud Queen. So we've got some options here going into it. We've got some objectives up for grabs. I think the only one that's safe there out of the Scions is our initiative. So let's move on to round 4. And we'll get rid of all our activation tokens, get them off the battlefield. And then we'll also look at any markers that were used earlier on, like this one, to halve the movement. And we'll get rid of that. And then we'll get started on the final round, round 4. It's the round 4 initiative. The Scions go first, and they get a nice triple there, 555 and 3 singles. And both warbands here are going to be looking to get the initiative to have the first activation. But the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers, let's see what they do. And they get a double 1 and 4 singles, so they're really looking to steal that away. And they got the priority so far, and they add a double. And don't forget, they've got that wild dice from the previous round, and they make another single. And so now they're going to go up against the Scions, who decide to make a single into a double 6. And the bitter rivals get stuck in straight away with the Shroud Queen moving on that Blazing Lord before he comes at her with an attack. And she's so weakened, she doesn't want to risk that. So she's going to attack him. She gets the extra dice, and it's a terrible roll. She does so badly. And let's see if that does any damage at all to the Blazing Lord. And even with that bad roll, he takes 4, but that's just a scratch to him with a total of 20 wounds. And that ends her activation. And now it's time for the Scions, and our Fireborn moves up to protect his Blazing Lord, and he's going to see if he can take out the Shroud Queen himself, steal a little bit of glory, and also avoid any attacks from the Shroud Blade. And this is going to allow the Blazing Lord then to do some serious damage. So our Fireborn, he's going to just go at it with a double, and he's going to use the Fiery Might ability with a double 6, and he rolls his dice. And so not a great roll for our Fireborn now, but let's see if that does any damage to the Shroud Queen. Just 1, 2 damage. She's hanging on in there. She's pretty tough and effective in this battle, and it's going to be up to the Blazing Lord to finish her off as the Fireborn ends his activation. Right, now the Slaughter Shade has got to come in and protect the Shroud Queen and make an attack, and she's choosing to get close enough to the Blazing Lord here to make an attack. And let's see what damage she can do with her Shadow Whip. And as she cracks the whip, again, not a great roll, but does that do any damage? Let's have a look. It's going to put a little bit of wounds on there, taking 4 up to 6. So with 6 wounds and 14 wounds remaining, our Blazing Lord is really strong. But she's not finished there. With those doubles, it's time for some more cursed darts, and well within that 9-inch range. She flicks the darts. That's great. One misses, flies by his head, but the other one hits, and that's going to do 2 damage, and that's also going to halve his movement for his turn. So we'll see if that's effective when it comes to the Blazing Lord. But that ends the activation for our Slaughter Shade with Shadow Whip. With plenty of time to act, the Blazing Lord decides to wait, and the Initiate moves in to really claim that objective, and that's his now. He owns that, so he's going to end his activation. There's no enemy in range, so his job's done, and now it's back to the Shadowstalkers, and our Shroud Blade with Cursed Swords is going to take action, and he's looking at his abilities, weighing them up, and he's going for, before any other actions, the Cursed Darts on a double. And he flings 2 darts with a terrible roll, so they both miss, so no damage going against our Fireborn there. And he moves up in contact, gets a little bit closer to the blades as they tangle, and now he's going to make an attack. So 1 move action to move, and the second action is an attack action. And with 4 rolls, this is a huge roll for this Shroud Blade, who rolls 2 critical hits. And let's see what damage that's going to do against our Fireborn, who's already been damaged with 6 from the Shroud Queen and 2 extra sneaking in. With another 8 there, that's plenty to take this Fireborn out of the battle, and that's the end of that Fireborn. That also ends the activation. Oh, he's reluctant to go, but that ends the activation for the Shroud Blade, and now it's the turn of the Scions, and the bitter rivals coming into play now. The Blazing Lord, it's time for him to take it out on the Shroud Queen, and he's well within range of the Shroud Queen, but he doesn't want to just make a normal attack. He wants to go out in glory, and with a triple, he's going to use his triple dice for a double called Beheading Strike, and he's going to go straight in at the Shroud Queen with 5 dice because of the twist card. And not a great roll, but let's see if that's done enough damage to take out our Shroud Queen. And it certainly has. 4 damage takes her up to 21 wounds, and that's the Shroud Queen out of the battle, and that's the end of her. And although she had a great round in round 2, this is her finish now, and the Blazing Lord is pretty happy with himself. He's protected his objective, he's got rid of his rival, and it's looking good for the Scions of the Flame at this point. But wait, he's not had enough yet, and he's going to make another attack. And with a pretty lousy roll there, those 3s are still going to do some damage against our Shroud Blade. And he swings his sword around, causing some damage, putting 4 wounds on our Shroud Blade. And then that's going to end his activation. And he's even smugger now than he was earlier. So he's pretty pleased with himself. And then let's move on to now the Shadowstalkers. And here we've got that Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear, still fighting the corner, not going to give in, and she's going to make an attack against the Inferno Priest. And I think our Shroud Blade is just trying to save a bit of face here. It's more out of principle, but oh no, terrible roll. So with the second action, she chooses to attack again, and it's awful. This is terrible news, and that ends the activation for our Shroud Blade, who didn't really do anything at all this battle. And the Inferno Priest is laughing there, but wants to have a go back, so chooses to attack the Shroud Blade with Umbral Spear, and is going to make an attack with the first action, and then let's see what that is going to be. And that's not enough to take out a Shroud Blade, so the Inferno Priest goes again with another attack, a poor attack, and this is just going to inflict a few wounds on our Shroud Blade, so they're going to take 4 from that attack and remain in the fight. And that's the end of the activation for our Inferno Priest, and a slap in the face to the Shroud Blade. And that brings us to the end of the battle with all fighters activated. So let's take a look and see who's got the most objectives. So here we are. We've got a few fighters left on the battlefield, and our Initiate is holding 1 objective on his own. Then we've got our Blazing Lord on a second objective, but he is also being contested by one of the Shadowstalkers, and the third objective has got no fighters within 3 inch, so that one's not claimed. And so that means with the Scions having 1 objective, they actually win. So this battle goes to the Scions of the Flame, and they are the champions. They've held off, they've defended the objectives well, and fought their opponents. But what a sickening sight for this poor Slaughter Shade, who is just 1 or 2 millimeters shy of 3 inches. And if she just stepped a little bit closer to that objective marker, that would have completely turned things around, and they would have drawn, which would have meant the attackers would have won. So the Shadowstalkers here were millimeters from victory, and just with a careless move, instead of just moving that little bit closer, she was more keen on protecting her Shadow Queen and going after that Blazing Lord, and it pretty much cost them the battle. So a little bit of an error there, but bad luck for the Shadowstalkers, but great news for the Scions of the Flame for holding those objectives and winning the battle. So with the end of our first battle report, let's take a quick recap and look at what went on here, and some errors were made. Certainly the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers should have started to move over that building, used the fly abilities maybe instead of those darts, and got closer to that objective. They could have lured the Scions across, because they were always going to send 1 or 2 fighters in that direction, and then that would have effectively taken them out for one of the rounds, and then they could have advanced on that objective. But they didn't. They chose to go head on, and that was a big mistake that left 3 fighters completely out of the battle. And then we've got our 2 Scions here who were very defensive, surprisingly, at the beginning, and perhaps they could have moved and advanced on taking the range out of this Dark Flame Warlock early on and making a battle of it at the bottom, and then used their hammer to come across and allowed their shield to move in and protect the objectives against that weaker force that would have come from the top right from the KHAINITE Shadowstalkers. So overall, a great battle, lots of lessons learned, and I can't wait for the next one. I hope you enjoyed this battle report, and I'd love to hear your feedback, so please let me know in the comments below what you thought, what you liked, what you didn't like, and I can use that feedback to improve on the next battle report. I really enjoyed it. There's a lot to learn here and a lot of practice, I think, until I get it as I want it. But for a first battle report, I'm really happy to get these up and running, and hope you enjoyed it. Look out for the next battle report coming soon, where we'll delve under to the dungeons of the Catacombs. And thanks so much for watching. Please like if you like it, subscribe for more content like this, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.